And hello and welcome to the Malmaison Hotel here in Manchester and the latest of our Broadcast Revolution events. This one is a focus on both the BBC's and ITV's work at the regional and the local level, but with considerable support from national teams. It's terrific to be here in front of so many people. This is the biggest event we've had in terms of attendance here in the room for some time, post-pandemic. I know several hundred are also joining us online, so welcome to you. We are live streaming all of this. And this event is also going to be watchable in full via our website when it's added to our Broadcast Revolution site at the start of next week. All our events, by the way, from the last couple of years are there to be savoured. My name is Mike Young. I joined Broadcast Revolution just under 2 years ago after 21 years as a producer, a presenter, a reporter at various levels of the BBC, largely at Radio 4 and at Radio 5 Live. Before that in BBC Local Radio and Radio Nottingham in particular. Just down the road then from us here is Salford's Media City, where I worked for many years. It keeps growing in numbers of staff. 5 Live, BBC Sport, BBC Breakfast, BBC Children's are there, ITV Granada is there too. 6 Music, Radio 4, Radio 3, Radio 2 programmes coming from there, BBC Religion, all have big teams there. And most recently, the BBC's business unit. Now, the Work and Money team it's about a year into its life in Salford, having moved up from London. It's also home to the BBC's central news service, and we'll be hearing more about that in just a moment. A couple of points of order for you. For those watching the live stream, if you would like to ask a question of either of our guests today, you can do so. It's via our Twitter account, at Broadcast Revo is what you're messaging there, at Broadcast Revo. Or you can ask a question or join the chat using the hashtag Join the Broadcast Revolution. I'll do my best to get through those as we proceed through this hour or so of conversation. If you're in the room and you have a question, do pop your hand up when I invite questions, and we'll try and get to you as fast as possible. We do have a microphone that will be doing the rounds. I think my colleague Dan will be passing that around. I will wait, and if you can, wait until you've got the microphone in your hand before you ask the question. Otherwise, those watching the live stream won't be able to hear it. Our 2 guests today then are Chris Brindley, who is the editor of the BBC's Central News Service. Now, CNS in a nutshell provides content to the considerable world of BBC Local Radio. Now, Chris and I worked together at 5 Live for many years. Chris has also been a stalwart of both BBC Radio Manchester and of BBC Radio Leicester. Sarah Colley is now a Content Hub producer for ITV Regional News. Now, this is a team of people who feed content into the regional ITV newsrooms. Sarah is based in Gateshead and has worked at ITV Tyne Tees. She's worked for the Bauer Radio Group. She's been at Metro and CFM. She's worked for Made in Tyne and Wear as their head of news as well. And Sarah, if I may turn to you first, let's talk about the Content Hub, how it works. What is it in a nutshell from you, please?
So basically, our team provides up to 10 minutes of content to all ITV regional news programmes in the opted regions. We're talking about services news programmes that provide 2 news services, so they might have an east and a west. But basically, we provide 10 minutes of content every evening midweek. So that comes from our central team. And we do all kinds of things, from human interest stories, politics, consumer stories. We line up guests, we produce graphics that are shared out across all of those regions.
So there is one reporter sitting somewhere in the UK, because there's a hub of reporters kind of scattered around the UK. And that one reporter will be working on 11 different packages for 11 different ITV regional newsrooms.
Yeah, so basically we have an editor, I'm the producer, we have 6 reporters, and they are dotted across the different ITV regions. And what we do is we decide what story that we're going to work on, but we make sure that every story we do has at least one bespoke element from each region in it. And what we do is, so we decide what story we want, then we put a note out to regions and ask for them to send what we call a regional request, which is a local bit of content that we're going to add to the piece. So we might say, please can you find a case study of someone who, has been furloughed because of the pandemic. So every region will go out and film with somebody, send that material to us, and we'll add it to the other elements of our package, and the reporter will make 11 versions, and then all of the regions will run that item on the same day.
And does every region always allow sort of 10 minutes for that material? Are there times where particular regions might step away from that for a period and then come back to you?
It is designed that regions do take the 10 minutes of content every day and they run the same pieces on the same days. Obviously, if a region has got, you know, a massive breaking news story, then sometimes they might call us and say, look, you know, we can't use this piece today for other reasons. But generally, they're using those items on those set days.
Okay, we'll be back with you to talk about sort of what sorts of items we're really talking about there, develop that a little bit. But Chris, the BBC's Central News Service. Now, I remember it in a past life. I worked for it, but it was the General News Service.
Yeah,
I worked at Westminster, and I would be doing two ways about questions in the House of Commons, all of that sort of stuff. General News Service is no more. Central News Service, now in Salford. Mm-hmm. What are you responsible for? What are you overseeing?
I'm effectively an air traffic controller between the regions and local and network. That's fundamentally what it is, and that's across all platforms. So I have 4 news editors, 1 who looks after radio, 3 who look after online, 2 of which are news for the England Online pages, and 1 for sport online and live pages. Fundamentally, we provide local, national content for local stations in forms of guests, in forms of packages, in terms of audio, and also in radio we get content, that really good content from local and regional, and move that towards network. So work really closely with the 6, the 10, Breakfast TV, News Gathering, Radio 4, Radio 5, and sort of it's a two-way street really. So 1 is national content for the regions and local. Secondly is getting the really good content, whether that be from TV or online or radio, and moving that towards network.
So back in the day, 20 years ago, when I was reading breakfast bulletins on Radio Nottingham, we would get an enormous amount of national news material coming in, and I would weave that into the local radio output that we were working on. And that continues to be the case. It's a way of getting national news through to the local.
Yeah, and national news and network are really, really, really keen on the stuff from English regions because we're the closest to the audience. We're the same for ITV, we're the closest to the audience. And so whether it be cost of living, whether it be Eurovision, you know, we will get that real people content and really give network, who probably a little bit more detached, which naturally they would be, what are people actually talking about? And with that sort of intelligence link as well.
I've always felt that sort of local and regional newsrooms have a particular finger on a pulse for their patches. They live and die by that, frankly. In terms of the sorts of people who are listening to your material, it's the local radio audience we're talking about. Can you talk us through who that person is, if you had a stereotypical local radio listener?
So, I don't really like stereotypical listeners. I think it's someone who, you know, of any age, who genuinely cares about where they live. That's fundamentally it. They care about where they live, what's going on in their local area, all communities, all walks of life, really, and that's what's really, really important. We tend to have we have an almost 50% C2D audience. I hate the phrase C2DE, but that's how it's categorised. So we're part of the BBC, which has, I think, one of the highest of that demographic, which is really good, and that's why a lot of network tap into us, so they hear all of that. We have links with communities, but fundamentally it's people who really care and really passionate about their area and what's going on where they live.
And of course, there's sports coverage at the local level, going through the local radio stations, and my thinking is that local radio will always survive in some shape or form as long as there is sports commentary.
Sports massive, absolutely massive.
And that makes your audience often a lot younger than some people might stereotypically think. I mean, I remember when I was in local radio, we used to think maybe mid-50s was the age group that we were broadcasting to. But it's so much more multifaceted than that.
It is, yeah. Sport's a massive driver, and younger audiences really sort of, you know, appeal to that. Also, it's the really good, you know, really engage with your football clubs, you know, rugby league, and also it's the bigger events. It's the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games. The athletes from those patches, which are really, you know, going to the Olympics and telling the story from your point of view. That has a lot of engagement as well.
What's a typical, if you can, ITV regional news viewer? Are you aiming for a particular age group, for example?
Well, I would agree with Chris, you know, that we don't have any stereotypical viewers. It's people who, you know, love their region, want to know about local stories and issues. And, you know, we do have a very loyal audience and they like to keep coming back to us.
We were finding in our research that the pandemic actually drove up local radio audiences, it drove up regional television audiences. It wasn't just people tuning in for the press conferences of Boris at Number 10. People really, the sense of community that probably you needed during the pandemic, was that your experience?
I mean, I'm sure it was said for both of us, but actually, with local, whichever platform you're on and whichever company you're from, we live and we're part of those communities, and I think that's a massive connection we have with the audience. I think that, and the audience, I think, see that connection.
I think they really trust us as well.
Yeah.
Yes, possibly more than any other element of the national broadcasters that you work for, that finger on the pulse of a region. When there are job cuts made at a local company, you will have the links, you will know, and you'll be broadcasting to those people affected. And I think that's where awards have been won very often, is actually the changing shape of a region, of a local patch. Very often I think people might think, okay, I'm watching a local television newsroom, I'm listening to a local radio station, they'll be thinking the audience isn't vast. You guys are at the national level actually feeding in to those areas, and actually we're talking about millions of people. You first, Sarah, I mean, I know you have a figure where put all of ITV's regional newsrooms together and the audience is...
So we've got up to 4 million people viewing our content every evening, so yeah, the audience is vast.
The estimation is that about 300,000 people or so are watching regional television news, whether it's on the BBC or on ITV. That would just about correlate with what you're experiencing. Put it all together, about 4 million people.
Yeah.
Local radio, you're quite proud of really being a national network when you put all of the local radio stations together. So how many millions of people are listening to local radio when you put it all together?
So it's about 8 million in terms of local radio. That includes Scotland, Wales, and the nations as well. So around 8 million, which is about the same as Radio 1. Sort of Radio 1 and local radio have been sort of flip-flopping for that third place in terms of the BBC networks, behind 2 and 4. In terms of English local radio, it's just under the 6 million mark.
Right, so you are including in that 8 million Radio Scotland, Radio Ulster and Radio Wales. Okay. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the content that you guys really love to have. And you first, Chris, if I may. I mean, there are so many different elements to CNS, but let us assume that somebody is going to be offered for a run of interviews. Are they still roughly 8 minutes in duration for sometimes an hour, sometimes 2 hours for local radio stations? Breakfast programmes might bite into that. Mid-morning programmes still?
It's mainly breakfast and drive at the moment.
Breakfast and drive.
I think always changes, doesn't it? Everything changes all the time, but breakfast and drive are the key ones we...
Okay, so there you are, and you know that in a few days' time you are wanting somebody for Thursday to go on breakfast programmes up and down BBC Local Radio Land. What's the ultimate guest, the dream guest that you want?
So again, it depends very much on the story. So I think relevance is really important. Relevant, and when I mean relevance, I mean how is it affecting people's lives? Is this a story that's affecting people's lives where they live? Not something that's a talking head somewhere else, or something that's quite processy. So real people, real stories that affects people's lives. I think that's really, really important. And in terms of the guest, they obviously, particularly with radio, same with TV, I know as well, but they've got to be a really good talker. I think that's really important. Have a little bit of personality is good, and not too formal. We're really conversational with our audience, and that's really important. So they've got to be able to talk in normal language and conversational language. You always say, imagine you're in the pub or you're around the kitchen table. That sort of conversation is the sort of conversation we want to be having, and language and terminology that we all understand.
Everything's become more of a conversation rather than a lecture now, and that's kind of, I mean, we work in media training, and that's kind of very much what we're trying to put across, and you'd reflect that. That's very much what you're wanting to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Content-wise, though, you're kind of talking about, okay, then the style of somebody in terms of the interview. Subject matter. Mm-hmm. What would be the perennials for CNS and the offer to local radio?
So we sort of do everything, really, that's national relevance. It could be anything from politics. So we've got a really good politics team, Millbank, and so recently you've seen the Liz Truss local radio interviews, which are done in the autumn, and then we work with newscasts, which is one of the record-breaking newscasts, went really, really well in terms of the numbers. So it's everything from politics to cost of living, clearly one of the biggest stories for all audiences at the moment, but actually, strictly, it's things that are relevant to people's lives and things that they are talking about. That's the really important thing. And that everything in the middle, again, we do Olympic Games, Commonwealth Games, World Cup, all that sort of stuff as well. So what we would say is it's either on the day something happening, or it's something topical that people are talking about. And that can be a positive story, that can be a little bit more showbiz, because actually, as we found out in the pandemic, TV is really important to people. But again, it's not every book that comes out, not every little TV programme, but something that the audience are talking about.
ITV Regional then, you're there working a few days in advance. We'll talk a little bit about the timings when people should contact you in a moment and how they should contact you. But what is your dream guest for one of your pieces, one of these packages? I assume the 10 minutes that you're talking about, that might be sometimes a live guest following a package. It might be a long package.
Packages, or we might produce graphics and live guests. We have down the line interviews. So it is a range of different of content for those 10 minutes. But, it's quite similar again to what Chris has been saying, but you talked a lot about finding stories of national interest. We're trying to find stories of regional interest that are relevant across all of those regions and people can relate to them. And we have a saying at ITV, real people first. It's all about getting the real people case studies on, people with lived experience of the issues that you're talking about, and people that people can really relate to. People want to watch stories and hear stories about people just like them, people who could be living down the road in their own communities. And I think that's what we're really striving for. And we do some celebrity interviews and sports stars and things, but they work if that celebrity can talk specifically about something in that region. So, for example, we did a really good piece actually just before Christmas with Jason Manford. We came here to Manchester and filmed with him. And you might think, well, he's just he's a Manchester comedian, but he was releasing this series of songs called Assembly Bangers. It was basically school hymns turned into these dance tracks. Anyway, he was raising money for the Trussell Trust. So we came here, we filmed with him, and he was talking, about these Assembly Bangers. He's a well-known voice that we thought that our audiences across our regions would know. We know that there are Trussell Trust food banks as well in every one of our region, and we got some stats from the Trussell Trust food bank as well about the number of people using food banks in each region. So we managed to turn that story from, what was essentially, a national story into something of interest for the region. And that's probably what we do slightly differently to Chris's team.
But I think we do very similar. We do national stories on a day-to-day basis, but also actually, if you're sending something that's not a breaking story, something on the day, what have you got that breaks it down, whether that be data, whether that be relevance to each of the regions and local areas, that they can then do something centrally, but also do their own content on locally as well.
For those watching the live stream of this, do keep your questions coming into our Twitter account. @BroadcastRevo is what you're aiming for there. You can use the hashtag Join the Broadcast Revolution as well. You touched on this, cost of living. I'd say that's probably the number one story for 2023. It was in 2022. Bye-bye pandemic, bye-bye Brexit before that probably is the dominant stories. Is that certainly true in both your cases, Sarah, first?
Yeah, it's obviously, massively important to our audiences, but also, what we don't want to do is just keep talking about doom and gloom and basically give people cost of living fatigue, which I think is what started to happen with people, during the pandemic. And then they start to switch off because they think, it's all I'm hearing about. So it's about finding those nice, maybe positive spins on stories and communities helping each other out, and just so it's not too depressing, because, we do want people to watch. We need viewers. We want people to watch and be engaged by it and relate to it. So, yeah, it can't be not too much cost of living.
And what about you, Chris? Cost of living, I mean, how dominant is that in the content of what you're doing?
I mean, look, like with everything, we do a balance of stories in all programmes, but cost of living is by far and away the biggest story for our audiences. I think it's the same everywhere, really. There's obviously other bigger things around as well, but that is sort of number one, really. And I think you're right. I think, we've got to reflect what's really going on. That's actually part of our responsibility that happens. But also, how can we help and support in terms of solutions? What advice and support is out there for people who are struggling? Where can they go? And I think that's part of our job as well. How can we help them, not just tell the stories of what sort of is happening, I suppose. And the other part of that is, as local radio has the Make a Difference campaigns and have awards, which have just been launched, in fact, this week again for this year. But we're also championing and celebrating people in the communities who are helping to make a difference as well. That's really important.
For those actually in the audience here in Manchester with us, if you want to raise your hand kind of from here on, Dan, my colleague, will be wandering around with a microphone. As and when you've got a question, just stick your hand up and I'll keep kind of looking up through the lights here and we'll come to you and do, as I say, wait until the microphone reaches you before you ask the question. But if you want to be sticking your hands up, you've already heard a little from the guys now. If there's something you would particularly like to ask either Sarah from ITV or Chris from the BBC, just stick your hand up and Dan will be coming towards you. So just stick your hand up whenever you hear something. I should mention, in terms of areas that you cover and areas that you don't, just in terms of the Content Hub, Manchester, strangely enough, isn't one of the patches, because, Granada Land has often been a big patch unto itself, I think. But where else do you represent? Pretty much everywhere else in England apart from Granada Land. Would that be true?
Pretty much. So we cover the Tyne Tees area, Anglia, Central, West Country and Meridian. We don't cover the Granada area, it's just such a big news patch and they're not one of those opted regions. And we don't cover the ITV border region because they not only cover Cumbria, but they also cover South West Scotland as well. And I think to then, ask them to cram in 10 minutes worth of our content would probably be a bit overload. So, but yeah, we basically cover 11 different regions because they're split up into east and west or north and south patches as well.
So Central News in the Midlands has an east and a west newsroom, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. How long has the concept been actually going for, the Content Hub?
So in its current form, I think it launched in something like September 2019. And then, it was just getting going. We were asking regions to send in their content and their regional request. And then the pandemic hit. This was actually before I joined the team, but, trying to get used to a new way of working and 10 minutes of everyone's programme every night. Yeah, and then the pandemic hit and it was like, how are we going to manage, how are we going to make engaging television where you can't meet anybody? So, that was a period of change. And then I'm quite lucky really that when I joined the team, it was in March 2020, we were sort of
right
out.
When the pandemic started.
Sorry, I must have been 2021. It was as we were coming out, so I feel like I managed to skip that, and we've kind of bedded in now, and we're just a normal feature in everyone's programmes.
Some questions are coming through, as I say, at Broadcast Revo on Twitter. If I may, I'll put these to both of you, and in no particular order, but in order that they're coming through to me. How important is regional data? Does it matter if a voice isn't regional, if I have local stats, local figures, local research? Chris first, if I may.
Yeah, so I have a data team as part of an England data team as part of my team based in Birmingham. Regional data is really important, and local data as well, not just region. Actually, you can even make it local. That's even better because then local stations will run it as well on a smaller scale. But again, careful with the numbers and representation, how many that is. But really important, because then what can happen is we could offer, if you had a national guest from wherever they were from, we could offer that guest, and then the regional stations and local stations can do their own follow-up guest or reporting or whatever around that themselves.
Right, so basically, when we're talking about local data, if we were talking about air pollution, for example,
Yep.
I mean, obviously somebody in Nottingham, somebody in Newcastle is not particularly interested in what London's pollution levels are. So it's breaking it down. County-wide, city-wide, I mean, you'll get all sorts of stats that will fly across your desk. Is there any preference? Do you like it to be by a region?
I mean, at least by region, and if you can go local, by local authority. Again, depends what the data is, depends how it's presented, isn't it? But regional, absolutely. But if you can even get to local, and when I say local, that'd be county or local authority, that's even better. But I know numbers then become less representative in data, don't they? So, but regional, absolutely.
Now, I find that television regions, whether it's BBC or ITV, are roughly the same sorts of areas. I assume you would always favour regional data if you possibly could, or do you like it to sometimes go right in to a particular city?
I think it depends what the story is, but because we are kind of replicating a story across a number of regions, it does help to stick roughly to the ITV regions, and we are lucky that a lot of data already does. But, stats only really work for us if it's a story that, is an issue in all of those regions. So if you're saying that antisocial behaviour, is a really big problem in Birmingham, and there's 50 cases a week, but then in Newcastle there's 2 cases a week, it just doesn't work for us. We can't really scale that up and make it make it work for all of the regions. It obviously is great to have regional stats. I think, as Chris touched upon, it needs to be, really credible research from good sources with a decent number of respondents, if it's surveys and that
general rule
type
of thumb,
of thing.
minimum 1,000?
Yeah, I think so. But I would say our absolute aim on any story is to have a regional case study. Someone who's from that region, they might have a local accent and can talk passionately about that issue in their own region. That's gold, really.
I think there's probably a sense of immediacy that can be turned around maybe slightly more easily by the Central News Service than possibly your work. If we are talking about the right time to contact you, what sort of time frame is there for that poor reporter, wherever they are in the UK, who's got to make 11 different packages? I can't quite fathom it, actually. It must be quite a stress. How long does that take?
So in an ideal world, it's good to have 2-3 weeks advance notice of any story, because we do work on, features and issues and original journalism and content that, does take more than a day or so to work up. But also adding into that, and the reason we do need that kind of running time is that we are asking regions to go and pick up content. And, we don't like to ring and say, we need this item tomorrow. Sometimes we're asking them to pick up really difficult case studies, or we're asking for, a police and crime commissioner, and we're asking people to give up their time. So we tend to give regions, a week to go out and pick up that content and send it back to us. And the reporter who is turning around those 11 versions, we give them a whole day to do that.
Right.
So that they can just focus on getting that right, because it is an awful lot of content to turn around.
Yeah, so at least a week, I would say, possibly is sensible. If there's something, amazing piece of research or something you're working on, give Sarah's team at least a week, possibly more. Central News Service, BBC, you can probably turn around a bit quicker than that, but what's the ideal?
Well, it very much depends on what it is. As far in advance as you can get it to us, really. I have on the day teams and we have a planning team, so actually, the sooner we can get it in, the better. And I think there's two things to say. One is, a lot of that, in terms of the radio guests we might offer, depends very much on what the news agenda is on the day. We're there to do the main stories of the day, or the main topical stories of the day for local stations. But if you've got a really good story, now we may not do a guest on it, but what I can do is distribute that to the regional television networks, to radio, and to the regional digital editors, so they can maybe do something that for themselves, even if we don't offer a guest on it. So if you've got a good story, contact us and we can help distribute it, even if we don't necessarily do a guest on it.
How often are you doing pre-recorded interviews so that you're clipping those to actually feed in for maybe the next day's bulletins? How often are you offering live interviews? A mishmash, I suppose.
Rarely pre-recorded, so it's live guests really. So when we offer a guest out, as you said, Mike, it's 8 minutes slots for a couple of hours or an hour. So it'll be up to stations themselves whether they do that live or pre-recorded. But expect a lot of those will be live now, really.
Do let us know, by the way, if you are tweeting in who you are and maybe where you work. It's always useful to know. There is actually a question here around that, which is the technical side of contribution these days. There's been such a change since the pandemic. How are people getting on the air doing these interviews on local radio? Are they sitting at home and doing it via Skype, Zoom, FaceTime? Are they going into a local radio station, as was often the case in days of yore, and using an old-fashioned ISDN? What ways are people getting on the air?
It's mainly FaceTime audio.
Really?
Is the biggest one, and by far the most we use. Different stations are at different technical setups, so Skype can be tricky in some, Zoom tricky in others. Again, depends a little bit what it is, but FaceTime audio is by far the easiest to do.
So someone literally is being contacted for that 8-minute segment. Is there a central point where maybe a guest is sat there? Because that was the beauty of the ISDN, where somebody would be sat in a studio and stations would dial in and out. Does that happen now, or is it really just you will be called at 8 minutes past 8, 16 minutes past 8, etc., etc.?
Yes, so what happens when we book a guest, we then have a producer who will arrange all the slots, and then we'll give that to you or to your guest, and then we'll know who's going to call them. And the stations now are very good at keeping to their slots. However, there are times where we have guests already in buildings, they will use one of our studios, or if it's a more high-profile guest, we will often offer them on Zoom, so the press officer can but you will have to let them in and out. We haven't got staff who will let them in and out of the Zoom room, so you would set it up and do it that way. But just bear in mind, not every station can do Zoom very easily. Most can, but FaceTime audio is by far the easiest.
Is there a preference from you? I mean, do you love to have somebody go into a studio? Or now, I mean, the technicals have tended to work so well because of the practice during the pandemic. You're quite happy with Zoom. You're quite happy with FaceTime.
Yeah, FaceTime audio, the quality is excellent. It really is excellent. Why make people travel and, get on the bus or drive or get the train when actually they can just do it? As long as your broadband quality is really good. I think I would say that.
Yeah.
We don't want it dropping out every 10 seconds, so I think that's really important, or the phone signal, the 5G, etc. But yeah.
For anyone that's joined us a little late in the proceedings, you're watching Broadcast Revolution's latest event from Manchester. Our guest today, Chris Brindley, the editor of the BBC's Central News Service, and Sarah Colley, a content hub producer for ITV's regional news. Your preference then for packages, I assume you're still sending a reporter to do something face-to-face and pre-recorded.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because we're the opposite, and it's great that you can use FaceTime and Zoom and things. But the main difference, I think, in between us is that, our pieces rely on pictures and we want people to watch. And Zoom interviews are just not interesting. They're not visually engaging and they're really boring, and the quality can be really awful for people watching on TV, especially when the internet drops out and they go all crackly. And so what we have tried to do is we only use Zoom as an absolute last resort, or video calls, and we have gone back to our original bread and butter, which is going out, seeing people in person, taking a camera and interviewing them, and then going back to base and editing it.
Would there be a situation in these 10-minute sort of excerpts, segments that you're working on, where you'll be working on a package, but then there will be an array of live guests, perhaps in the various regional newsrooms, live off the back of a piece?
Yeah, no, we do that. We do that quite regularly. We call them down the lines, and it's similar, really, that we have slots. And we stick to the same time slots. And I know I talked a lot about, we need advance warning, but things like down the line and guest interviews, we probably do only need to know the day before, or if it's really breaking news and somebody's got a guest that you think we could work with, we can make that work on the day. But we quite often will do a package that might set up a subject. So we did one the other day, it's 100 days to the local council elections, and we were doing a piece about the number of local councillors that are experiencing abuse. So we went to speak to local councillors, heard their stories about their experiences of abuse, and then off the back of that we spoke to the local government association, and every region did a 3-minute interview with them talking about their Debate Not Hate campaign and how this hate has a real impact on local democracy. So that's kind of how we make that work.
Interesting question here from Emma from Intelligent Profile, who's tweeted at Broadcast Revo. Calendar days or specific months, do you love them or loathe them? We're talking about National Whatever Day or National Whatever Month. My own experience as a producer was, we'll run it if we like it and we want to speak about it at any point in the year. Chris first, where do you stand on those?
I'm not a fan, if I'm honest, because they're not real. Clearly, there are some things that are really important we do. There are like Black History Month, and lots of other things like that are really important we do. Which, if there's a news or topical relevance to it, great. I think that's really good. But just it's random National Hamburger Week, I'm not going to do it.
Whereas National Hamburger Week, ITV will love it.
I mean, there is literally a day for everything, isn't there, now? But yeah, it depends what the peg is. Like I said, we did a piece the other day, 100 days to the local council elections, but that is relevant because you're wanting people to come forward and put themselves forward as local councillors. So there is a difference. So I'd never say never, but definitely no hamburger days, please.
A particular question, probably a particular question, I think, for you, Sarah. Sana from Action for Children's media team asks, in terms of video content, how likely is it that you would run video content that's made in-house by the charity or an organisation, or would you prefer always gathering your own material there?
Yeah, so we really do need to have editorial control of any interviews that we do. So, yeah, we can't take interviews that other people have done and charities or brands and any organisation and run it. If they have got some B-roll footage where they might have taken some film of, a charity event that they've been at, we might be able to use that and credit it, but absolutely no when it comes to interviews, I'm afraid.
A further follow-up question from Sarah, actually. We refer to B-roll, which for the uninitiated, really a video footage, really, to be used in pieces. What B-roll can work, does work? What is good B-roll? Short and sweet? Do you want to drown in the stuff?
If we were using it, we'd probably only use 20 seconds of it, and we would always credit it to the organisation that it came from. But, it still has to be quite decent quality, I think, if we're going to use it. But, we would rather not use it, and we would rather work on stories that have the picture there that we can go and film ourselves as a priority. Intriguing
question here from Jim. Which stories do you struggle to get guests to speak on? Are there any subjects? Or, I mean, you'd think you're working at almost a national level and feeding into the locals and regions. Are there any areas where you're struggling to get voices? Chris first.
I wouldn't say. What I would say is you sometimes struggle to get diverse voices in some areas. I know we're all working on really hard on that. So I think when you're looking at guests, clearly, if you're a professor in something, that's your expertise area, you are who you are. That's absolutely the right thing. But, diverse voices, so we have a broad section of voices for our guests. I think for our listeners, rather, that would be really important.
Diversity is an interesting point raised, actually. Gender, ethnicity, all sorts of things. How much of that is a priority for you in making sure that diversity is truly reflected?
It's really, really important. It's a top priority for us. As I mentioned earlier, we really want our programmes to reflect the diverse communities that we serve. Historically, you might get a lot of male spokespeople from organisations. People would put forward their top CEO, and actually, we're finding there's a lot more females in those roles now, which is great, so we can have more of a split. But I think, what you're finding now is that we like organisations to put forward, maybe volunteers, people who've had a lived experience in the subject that we're trying to get across. So people can just relate to those people a bit more than, someone in a suit like me who comes along and talks about something.
A question from Brett here, and there's a political element to this, and I know you guys are here talking about content, but make of this question what you will, answer it as you wish. Brett says, given the increasing closure of some local newspapers, even some local radio stations, the switch to the sharing of regional content across many remaining local outlets, how do we make a local story stand out to you so it will be interesting across an entire region or across an entire area so it will be broadcast? Chris first.
A good story is a good story. At the end of the day, how relevant is it to people's lives? That's fundamentally it. Is it relevant to the people who are listening? And then I think if there's really good data around it, or a really good guest, or I think for me it's all about relevance to people's lives, and also think about timing a bit. And for me, I always have the so what sort of barrier. So what? You've got a great story. Why is it a great story? Why should our listeners care about this? With all the other national and international news going on, why should that cut through?
Echo that, would you say so?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Harriet Brace, Zero Waste Scotland, thank you for this question, particularly to Chris. Are you interested in big stories specifically tailored to Scotland? I mean, I know that CNS will feed into BBC Radio Scotland, but are you interested in somebody saying, it's only for Scotland, this one?
So I work mainly for England.
Yeah.
Look, if you send me something, I'll happily pass it on to them, but we don't work directly in that sort of sense with Scotland. They have their own nation planning
Working out
teams
of Glasgow, Pacific.
Yeah,
absolutely. Good time to ask, actually, and I've got a whole stack of people on Twitter all saying, when is the right time to reach out for you, but also how do we reach out to you? When I did one of these events with Sarah Sands, who is the editor of the Today programme, she said, 2 days before transmission, and don't phone us, we'll phone you. It's an email we want. Now, we've talked a little bit about when to contact you. What about the how? Sarah first, do you prefer to see an email, or is that going to end up in your junk box and a phone call is better?
Ooh, it depends how urgent it is, I think.
And what time of day they ring?
I will stress, we are quite a small team. As I mentioned earlier, we have an editor and we have a producer, and then we have the reporters. We don't have kind of one central inbox that everybody emails to. But I think it's about making, if you are sending an email, which I think is probably my preferred option, just make it really stand out, make it jump out when I'm in my inbox, when I'm opening it and thinking, oh yeah, this could be a really good story for us. And things that really help are, I can get you case studies in every region, or we have a diverse spokesperson or something really unique that makes it stand out, a bit like your So What thing, you know. So I think just make, when you're putting those emails together, think about what we want and put that right at the top.
Well, how long should an email be? I mean, I don't know how many you're getting on a daily basis. I mean, it needs to be something to attract your eye, but I would assume you want it to be as short, as informative as possible, but probably with a very catchy title in the inbox title, just to make sure you see it.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a commercial radio background. You've got to keep everything really short and succinct. You know, you had 60 seconds to cover off 4 stories. You know, I think you can get your point across in 1 or 2 lines. And then, you know, if I want more information, I'll follow it up. Do
you cover Wales in your work?
No, I'm afraid not. But, you know, as Chris said, if anyone wants to send anything, we're happy to send it across to the right team. And we do work really closely with ITV Wales.
I think the question from Amir here, working at Cowshed in Cardiff, and I think there's a way that you can answer this actually just really in the end. It's again all about content and what's in the email. What is the best way to pitch stories from Wales? Let's say the best way to pitch from a particular patch, because all of you are in the end going to try and super serve one particular area, because there's going to be a story that really works well in the northwest or Wales or Scotland or the southwest. What do you really want? We've got plenty of amazing organisations. We've got great case studies, particularly adopters and foster carers in terms of Cowshed and Cardiff. What are you wanting when there's a really strong story in a particular patch that is then going to spread out across all of the other patches? Chris first.
So what do we want from them, I suppose?
Yeah, what's really going to appeal?
A really good case study.
Yeah.
Is real people.
Case study before, or even sometimes before a top line, because sometimes there's a great individual. Yeah. And then there's a great top line. Sometimes, though, it's so much more about the storyteller these days, maybe more than ever before.
I think it probably is. You know, I think it's whoever's narrating that story and whatever, or you know, involved in that story. You know, we want real people involved. You know, in the context of what they're talking about. That's really important. But I'll say, you know, the top line's really important. And just going back to your email point as well, really. Actually, I want some more info in the email. But at the top, what is the top line of this story? Whatever category it comes in, what is the top line of this story and who's your guest? They're the 2 most important things to me. If you want to put below that a bit more information so we can look at it, that's great, but that's really important.
It wouldn't hurt really to do a who, what sort of situation. And because, I mean, you guys can ask the questions when you ring back if you like the story. Interesting one here from Phoebe. Thank you for this one, Phoebe. What is your relationship like with government communication teams? I mean, are you getting lots of communication from them, and are you going to smile on their sorts of stuff? Or maybe do you get too much stuff? Government communications in particular, at the local and national level, Sarah?
Well, you know, if it's a relevant story, we will cover it. And a lot of our stories that we cover, you know, are issue-based pieces. Cost of living things, you know, quite often do need a government response. So yeah, I think we have a good relationship with them.
Chris?
And we have a really good regional Millbank team who work in Westminster for us, and who are really, really great and really strong. So it's a mixture. So if there's a story we're doing and we feel like we need a minister or a Secretary of State, we will bid for them. But quite often as well, they will, no stories are coming up, they will offer to us. But we treat it like any other news story, you know. We don't prioritise those over any other topic. What is most important to our audiences today, and that's how we choose the stories.
I should say that hopefully we're getting through a nice range of questions for you guys who are actually here in the room with us. Do stick up your hand, as I say. We've got a lot on Twitter here. Oh, we actually do have one. So Dan, if you want to head through and pass the microphone, and if you'd like to say who you are, where you're from, and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm from the Trussell Trust. Thank you for the shout out earlier, Sarah. If we've got stories where, say, for half of your regions, we have case studies, we have people with lived experience, but for the others we're struggling and it's just going to be our CEO or a central spokesperson, is that still something that your teams would invest time in, or are you looking for something where we can put strong spokespeople for every region?
And maybe put that one to Sarah first.
Well, I think there's always a way around it. You know, if there isn't a regional case study, is there a spokesperson? Is there a particular food bank in that region where they haven't got a case study? that is doing something particularly interesting that we can film. So I think there are ways around it. I don't think we would discount it completely just because there isn't a case study in every region. And I mentioned earlier we cover 11, but my kind of thing is, if a story works for about 9, we kind of, that's the benchmark. But I just want to pick up on something that someone else mentioned earlier in one of the questions about, what makes a really good story. And I've talked a lot about real people in case studies, but we really, really, really need pictures. We have to be able to tell a story through pictures. And there are loads of really great stories out there, but if they don't work for television and we can't see anything happening, we really, really struggle. I mean, we've got an amazing graphics team who can bring all kinds of things to life, but we do need to have pictures and be out there and be seen in the communities.
Yeah, you don't need to be filming the pictures yourselves, but you need to be thinking pictures in terms of getting on the local telly.
Yeah.
I suppose the beauty for you guys is it's less visual, your medium still, just about, although there's webcams in every studio these days.
Full visualisation coming to our police station.
Yeah, well, we're almost wearing makeup today for this one. So what about that when it comes to the Trussell Trust?
I think I'd say 2 things. One, some stories aren't relevant to the whole of England, and that's okay. It might be coastal communities, or it might be the north of England if it's Transpennine, which is going on today, things like that. That's okay. If you have, for radio, if you have one really good central spokesperson who's good, and the story's just in the north, the 9 or 10 northern stations can bid for that, and that's okay. I'd say the other part of that is just when you break it down, you don't have to have a spokesperson for every region. I think
a stat is good.
A stat
the spokesperson could probably cover that data.
Yeah.
Yes. So
as long as your spokesperson can talk about all the regions themselves, that's fine.
Thank you for that question from the Trussell Trust. Chloe asked this question: are brand-led statistics with case studies of interest? And this is a good catch-all, really. Is that there are going to be brands watching this, large and small? Do you feel queasy when you're kind of dealing with, okay, this data from such and such a brand, or actually is there a way that can be useful, particularly BBC first, Chris?
It's difficult. So I think, again, is this a genuine news story, or is this a piece of PR for us, really? And that's a judgment we have. Clearly, Trussell Trust, if you've got, if it's a big news story, cost of living, everything at the moment, another thing, one of our regions today are doing a story around how a lot of food banks are asking for food that doesn't have to be cooked, so people can't afford to turn their ovens on. So actually, those sorts of things are fine. But again, is it a news story or is it a PR puff? If it's a PR puff, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just we're more limited in what we can do on that, I'm afraid.
Classically, the BBC, the rule of thumb would be a brand will get one mention. It might be if there is a brand on the air, there's going to be one mention of a brand. It's not a time to be name-dropping the brand. That's not going to work.
And I don't always agree to the one mention thing, if I'm honest, unless it's a new... For me, it has to be a news story. It has to be a topical news story.
Where do you stand on the role of the brand in your work, ITV?
Well, we can't advertise, that's an absolute no-no, and there has to be an editorial reason why we're working with that brand. And we do work with lots of different brands and lots of different companies, but it's because there's editorial relevance to the story. There is a kind of a limit to the number of times you can mention a brand in a story. We don't have that one mention limit, but for example, I'm going to give you an example of what absolutely we cannot do is, you might turn up on a charity shoot to do an interview with them about a campaign, and then they've got a banner up behind them that has the name of the charity plus a phone number in massive letters on how to donate. The person you're interviewing is wearing a jumper with the logo across the front. And then you've got to think we might have to introduce them in the voiceover, so that's another mention, and then they might get a mention on the name strap as well, and that's just far too much, and it's undue prominence, and it really goes across the line. But we can work with brands, and there are ways that we can bring them in, but that's just basically an example of what not to do, please.
Understood. Less is more when it comes to the brand mentions, and there's ways you can maybe do it. You were actually mentioning an interesting one, which was sometimes about whether a particular brand was maybe closing some stores, for example, or whatever. I mean, there is, of course, a way in there.
Well, that's got editorial relevance, and that's the difference.
And at that point, do you guys find that brands are willing to talk? Are the right people being offered to you sometimes? These are sometimes the biggest bosses, perhaps from individual regions or national bosses. Are brands, are organisations able and willing now to put forward their top team, their best spokespeople? Sarah first.
I think, you know, it's good to work with those brands who are not just trying to, you know, get a bit of free advertising that we do not do, but realise the importance of sort of taking part in a story and talking about, you know, the way their company works or their organisation, and they can talk to us about a whole variety of topics. So, for example, we did a piece, you know, just before Christmas about should bank holidays be more flexible? Should employers allow you to take them on days you want? Lots of people in this country, you know, don't celebrate Christmas, and they're using their annual leave to take leave at another time. So it's this kind of idea, and we were looking for a business who would come on and talk about their own bank holiday policy. And we did find, you know, a great cosmetics company that said, yeah, we do this, and they came on. And they weren't talking to us about how amazing their cosmetics were and that, you know, Kate Moss uses them, that type of thing. They were talking editorially about this whole flexible bank holiday policy and how they help their staff to take flexible bank holidays. And that's kind of how we can work with different brands. And you know, we got to go to a really nice office in London, and you know, there were some really nice pictures there as well that helped to tell that story. And we saw a diverse workforce. So it's things like that we can really work with brands.
Time is flying, everybody. We do have another question on the floor. This will be the last one, maybe from here. Dan, is the microphone there? Yeah?
I've got it already.
Who you are and where you're from, please.
Yeah, so Graham Whittam, and Chief Executive of Greater Manchester Poverty Action. So it's a case studies related question, which seems to be a bit of a recurring theme in terms of what's being discussed. We get a lot of media outlets, both national and sort of local, regional to the northwest, Greater Manchester, asking for case studies, not on the back of stories we put out, but in response to sort of national stories and regional sort of cost of living, poverty related stories. They're often very short notice sort of requests, and it's very hard for us. We don't have a dedicated sort of media or comms officer in at the moment, although we are recruiting one, so if people want to look at the job advert, please do. Probably a lot of suitable people in the room. Yeah, but one, I think the question really is would outlets like yours look to work with organisations like ours over time to build up a bank of case studies so those people are kind of ready to go? So I'm talking about people with lived experience of poverty, so those case studies are ready to go at short notice, because that's something I think would work really effectively for both parties. And then linked to that, I think one of the challenges that we've had media outlets reach out for us for case studies, and in the past we have supported those outlets to then access case studies. We've actually not got a hat tip name recognition as a result. You know, they've not necessarily had me on, they've had the case study on, and there's been no mention of the organisation. And obviously I get the points about not overdoing the brand, but from our perspective we've spent time, resources getting those case studies and not sort of received any kind of recognition as an organisation, which is obviously sort of problematic for us. So just interested in exploring those two things a little bit further.
Your latter point is actually echoes a lot of what people are saying on Twitter, which is, you know, we do something pre-recorded and then we won't get a mention at all. So let's start with the first question, though, to Sarah first. Working closely with an organisation, particularly maybe a charity, to try and develop some case studies, because it seems to be what we are always asking for, and we ask very often too late.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying about, you know, you might get a phone call on the day and it's really difficult, and you know, sometimes we're asking you to find people who, you know, might be quite vulnerable or, you know, in really desperate situations, and I think that is really difficult. And I guess it would help if you did want to find case studies that you did have a bank of people who were available to talk. The way that we work in our team is that usually I do know in advance the sort of story that we're wanting to cover. So, you know, I can put in a call early, and I'm happy to kind of wait for people to get back to me, and I know that they might be looking. So it doesn't always have to be an on-the-day turnaround. But I think it's great if all organisations sort of have a bank of people that they use regularly, and that the people that are also really comfortable with going on camera and maybe know a bit more about what it involves as well, so that when you're trying to find somebody on the day, it's not a mad chase and a race and it's coming out of the blue, and these case studies are really unprepared, because sometimes we're talking to them about really difficult circumstances.
I think sometimes we need, broadcasters need contact numbers, because sometimes actually it's a contact number. Someone might only be contactable by email. Actually just having the mobile number for that human being, so that actually a human being like Sarah can ring that human being and actually have a conversation, can actually get the wheels moving a lot faster. Chris, your thoughts there particularly in that area?
Yeah, I think a bank of people is really good. We try and do that ourselves on whatever the topic might be. We have a pool of people, and it's okay to return to those people on more than once if it's whatever the topic is, really. But I think my team wouldn't do that as much, but the regions themselves, so you're based up here in Greater Manchester, North West Tonight, the local radio stations, if build that relationship with them, and there'll be planning teams will be able to work with you to help, if you can build that relationship and have a little bank of 4 or 5 people who are willing to talk, rather than every time they call, have you got a new one, have you got a new one, that's really advantageous.
And the latter point, I think, making sure that there is a brand or a name mentioned or whatever, I think so much of it's about communication between who you are speaking to and what is feasible, what is possible. You're willing to actually say in advance a little bit of maybe the construct of a piece within reason, would you say, Sarah?
Yeah, and I think don't be afraid to ask when you're having those conversations with journalists who are asking for case studies. Don't be afraid to ask. Will we get a mention in this? Is it okay if we do get a mention? I might not be able to say, oh yes, we can definitely give you a mention. I might have to say, I'm really sorry, we only need a case study. But if you're in doubt, then just ask.
And Chris?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? I think it depends on the story a little bit. Everything we always say, it depends on the story, because there is no one size fits all, is there? So clearly, if we have a really good case study and we're randomly mentioning a charity, that's a bit strange. However, it's about relationships. So even if someone hasn't mentioned your charity that time or your organisation, actually, another time we come to do that story, we want someone from your charity to be a spokesperson. We have that relationship with you, and you come on, and obviously we talk about the charity then. But where we can and where it's relevant, where you've got a spokesperson from your organisation, we've got to mention where your organisation, who they are.
Okay, time has run out. We have been on for just under an hour. Chris Brindley and Sarah Colley, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and thanks to all here with us. I hope it's been illuminating, and for those of you watching. If you are watching the live stream, we have a few questions, should be appearing on the screen now, if they haven't already. We'd greatly appreciate your input, as it does help support these events and guide us on what you want to hear and see in these events going forward. Our next event, I should say, February the 23rd. It's a focus on our annual broadcast report. We've surveyed media, consumers, PRs, lots of facts, lots of stats to feed into your day-to-day work. Invites to that to attend online, that will be an online one, will be sent out shortly. My colleague, Ashley Carroll, formerly of Global, that's LBC, Classic, Capital, Heart. She'll be chatting to a leading light from Global's news team in the coming weeks too. We'll keep you posted on that. We'll hope to see you at both of those. But in the meantime, if those in the room would show your appreciation, please, to Chris Brindley and Sarah Colley.